think it's been hard for me to realize that it was the lead up to a meltdown because it's mischievous, they're very, very giggly, and they seem very, very happy and just hyper, so hyper. And so it was hard to recognize that. Today I'm going to be talking about sensory processing and how specifically what we've seen with two of our girls that I've only really just begun to understand when especially Tessie and Maggie are overwhelmed. A lot of times we don't see that as a meltdown. In fact, very rarely do we see sensory overwhelm as a meltdown with Maggie and Tessie. Usually that's way down the road. And one of the things that I think kept me from realizing for so long what them being overwhelmed looked like, especially with Maggie, is because it can really look sometimes like hyperactivity. And that is what I want to talk about today. This is going to be a little bit complicated for me to explain, but I'm going to do my best. All three of our girls are hyperactive, and I've been told that by so many different professionals, and I do believe it. Sadie is our only child who has been diagnosed with ADHD. She is our only kid so far who has been tested for ADHD. Patrick may be diagnosed with ADHD or I think probably ADD in the near future. I'm not sure. We will see. But Sadie is the only one officially who has that ADHD diagnosis, and she most definitely has it. She has been evaluated for it twice. Every time comes out with bells and whistles, full ADHD. And Sadie is happily hyper. She likes being hyper. At her age now, as an 11-year-old, she does a really good job channeling and controlling her hyperness at school and then coming home and being hyper at home. And she is able to do that. I want to be really clear that I'm not against medicating, but when we tried medication with Sadie, she really didn't like how she felt on it. We tried a couple things and both of them went really horribly wrong. We backed off from medication at that point and we went back to the psychiatrist, and Sadie was really adamant at that point that she didn't want to try medication again at that point. And so we were like, okay, we'll try this without it, and it has gone very well for us. I think this is one of those very case-by-case bases. But Sadie is hyper. She's hyper all the time. I mean, even when she controls it, she's still controlling being hyper. And that is just who she is. Maggie and Tessie, though, they're different. They definitely have a super hyperactiveness that you'll see around here, but it's not as constant as their older sister. And I definitely would think of them as calmer when they are all amped up and just bouncing off the walls. They have more downtime, whereas Sadie's kind of a constant perpetual motion machine. If you remember the Energizer Bunny commercials, that's Sadie. They aren't quite like that, especially not at home. Tessie particularly has, I think, given me some insight into Maggie in that when Tessie's at home, she's really calm. And when she's out in the world, she's really hyper. And that is what has given me some insight into sensory overload with Maggie and Tessie. Talking with Tessie's teachers, everyone who works with Tessie tells me how hyper she is everywhere else. At speech, at OT, at school, everywhere else she's hyper. At home, she comes home and she's usually so incredibly calm when she's here. She is by far my calmest kid. And everyone laughs when I say that at her school, at her therapies. But I don't think she's even hyper for a neurotypical kid when she's at home most of the time. And I was thinking about that more and more. I don't think it's just compared to her siblings. I think she's really calm most of the time at home. And then this week, there was a family math night at the kids' school. And we went there, and there were lots of kids, and I was holding Tessie's hand, and Paul was holding Maggie's hand. And we were trying to do it without the harness thing, which was probably a mistake. And as we walked into the school, the bottom of my 2-month-old snow boot decided to completely detach. It was attached by like this much of the tip of the snow boot. So it was like flapping, which additional challenge as I'm like trying to focus on Tessie and what the boys are doing at their school for math night and this shoe that's like falling apart on my foot. Very distracting, but not the point. So there's all these kids, and it's not super loud, but it's kind of loud, and it's an elementary school, so it's bright colors. Although you wouldn't think it's that different from Tessie's school, because Tessie's school is basically a elementary school that's full of preschool classes. And we walk in, and both Tessie and Maggie, it's like instant switch thrown from quiet and relaxed in the car to completely wild. Tessie is trying to run around every part of the classroom, completely out of control. She just wants to dump every toy on the ground that she sees and run to the next thing. And I am basically trying to hold her hand, keep her from running out of the room, keep her from running to every toy, just stop her every 2 seconds from getting into things, stop her from taking other people's math games, stop her from... And this is not how Tessie is most of the time. And we stayed, luckily my parents had come too. And so my parents ended up staying with the other kids, and after about 15 minutes, we ended up leaving. I had expected it to go much better than that. When we went to the math night at the middle school, it went better than that, but a middle school is quieter and a middle school is less bright and colorful. I was thinking about it as we left. I think it was just all of the sensory overload, both in brightness and in sound, that was too much for both girls. And I guess I should have really expected it. I kind of expected it as a possibility for Maggie. Maggie was kind of the same way. She was just looking for things to get into, slightly better. She sat down and did some puzzles with Paul, but then she was on the lookout for anything bubble guppies that she could get into, and she was convinced that there were bubble guppy things. And she was pretty hyper too, not as hyper as Tessie. I was thinking about it and thinking of how Tessie normally is in everyday life. I mean, I take Tessie to the store. I take Tessie just about everywhere with me, and she isn't usually hyper. I think that generally she tends to do a really good job regulating all of her sensory processing issues pretty well. But that when they get out of hand or away from her, she sort of goes into full hyper mode. She reminds me so much then in those moments where she is hyper of little Maggie when Maggie was 3, where it's like it feels like all communications shut down and she is just from one thing to the other, just going from thing to thing to thing to thing to thing. And ultimately, if that keeps going and going for very long, it's gonna end in like tears and a meltdown. But usually we end up removing ourselves from the situation and leaving, because that's pretty much the only thing you can do. Like going, getting in the dark car, getting in her car seat, and then it's just over. And she's like calm. And then she came home and she went to sleep. And Paul was in the car like, I knew that was gonna happen. I was like, but we do try to do things. And a lot of the times those things are successful. And sometimes they're like that and they're not at all. But I like to at least give the kids a chance to try. And then if we have to remove ourselves, we have to remove ourselves. And thankfully my parents are here so they can take the other kids, or sometimes just Paul leaves, or sometimes just I leave. We kind of switch it up, because a lot of times one of the girls will be okay with doing something and the other one won't. And that's how it ends up working. Like at James's concert, Maggie did awesome. Tessie made it through James's part, but then she was done, so she went out to the car. And Maggie was so excited through the whole entire thing, because Maggie really tends to like being at performances that are theater or ballet performances, and so we tend to be able to go to those. My overall point was, I don't think I realized Maggie's level of sensory overload through so much of when she was tiny. And even now, I think when we're out and she starts to get into that go, go, go mood, where whenever we're in a place and it suddenly seems like she's looking for trouble, I think that it probably is similar to Tessie, that because Maggie gets in that same place where it's like we'll be someplace and suddenly she's just looking for something, and then the next thing, and then the next thing, and then the next thing, and it's usually to get into things that she's not supposed to be in. Like we'll be at somebody's house and suddenly she needs to be in every single drawer, looking at every single drawer, and I just spend all my time stopping her from getting into things. That is usually when she's sort of overwhelmed, and we just have to stop and step back from the situation, because generally we are headed for a meltdown then. And even though for us, we've been fortunate because meltdowns tend to be rare, for us that is the lead up to a meltdown, is that seeking out, is that hyperness that is some sort of, it seems like it's a sensory overwhelm of too bright, too loud, too much, too new. I think it's been hard for me to realize that it was the lead up to a meltdown, because it's mischievous, they're very, very giggly, and they seem very, very happy and just hyper, so hyper. And so it was hard to recognize that as sensory processing sort of gone haywire, overwhelm. This is spinning out of control. We need to get into a quiet, dim place and just decompress and just calm down. And usually that has to be home or the car. And those situations are the best place for us to be, because those are kind of safe and they're quiet and they know that they can just kind of sit there and decompress. That usually stops the meltdown, that usually stops the buildup, that usually stops everything. Not quite sure why it took me 6 years to realize this. Last night we came home from watching the Super Bowl. Well, we only made it for like 30 minutes of the Super Bowl at my parents' house. And Tessie was very, very hyper about Patrick doing his homework. And she was jumping from chair to chair at the dining room table, and I kept putting her down, and she kept climbing on the table. And it was the exact same thing. She was trying to jump from the chest there over the backs of the chairs onto the chairs and then dive off of the chairs. And I kept putting her down. And so I tried reading her a bedtime story on the couch, and she was diving off the couch. And so finally I took her down to bed and put her in her bed, and immediately she went to sleep. That was when it all started to click in my head, and I started to realize, I knew when we were sitting at the table that it was sensory overwhelmed, she was overwhelmed. I was surprised when we went to the couch that she was still overwhelmed because the room was dark, but it was just still too much. And then once she got into bed and she put her 2 giant unicorns on top of her, it was okay, and she was done, and all was well. Anyways, I'm sure there's probably more to it. I just wanted to share my observations on how sometimes the path to a meltdown doesn't quite look the way you would think. It doesn't always look like anxiousness or like the classic signs to anxiousness. Around here, it doesn't always end in a meltdown, because usually we are able to sort of turn the course and diffuse it. But usually for us, the path to a meltdown looks like hyperness and giggling and more frantic behavior, I guess, just up until that moment where it's the tipping point and it actually turns into a full-blown meltdown because it's all just too much. That is it for today. If you like this video, we'd love it if you'd give it a thumbs up. And if you're interested in all things autism, we'd love it if you'd hit subscribe. And I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.